This weekend just gone, did Gloucester disrespect the Premiership as a competition, making a host of changes, naming a young team against the league leaders and losing 90-0, quite literally a cricket score? Because those are some of the questions and some of the discussions that have happened since the weekend. So you can let me know, give me your views, put it in the comments down below. Did Gloucester disrespect the league by making all those changes and then the result we ended up seeing? I look forward to reading your comments. Make sure you like the video and subscribe whilst you're here. But my top line from this, and I'll get into it and explain what I mean, is no, I don't think they've disrespected the league, but I worry about what the impact of the weekend, of the changes and of that result could have on their ultimate aim now this season, which is winning the Challenge Cup. And I'll get into that in more detail. So was it disrespectful? I'm sure there'll be some of you that are watching this video and think, yeah, it was disrespectful to the Premiership, to the fans, to make that many changes, to put in that performance and to be on the end of that result. But ultimately, I think, did they disrespect the league? No. And the reason I say that is for a few different reasons. First of all, teams often rotate. We've even seen it at some stages this year where teams have rotated and been on the end of pretty heavy scorelines. Not to this degree, admittedly, but it still happens quite regularly. And second of all, we often see teams rotate at the end of a season. Usually, though, we don't begrudge them when we often see it. Normally, it will be the teams that have already secured a home semi-final, a top four spot, and they're rotating their team for that reason. And we don't tend to have an issue with it. So therefore, if we don't have an issue with it then, I don't have an issue with it now in Gloucester's case. And just as a wider point, I think clubs have the right to manage their playing squad and their resources in the way that they see fit. Gloucester have a right to rotate and name a weakened team for the game at the weekend. I don't necessarily think they should have done, but that's a different conversation. And specifically in relation to if it is disrespectful to the Premiership, as some people might argue, I don't think it is. What it has done, though, I think, is highlight some of the issues currently in the Premiership, which is the English side's inability to compete in two competitions, which has been something we've seen for a little while. I know Northampton and Harlequins did brilliantly to get to the Champions Cup semi-finals this year, but generally speaking, I still don't think the English clubs have the overall quality across their squads to be able to compete on two fronts. We've seen it over the last few years, and I think this reinforces that when you see Gloucester off the back of getting themselves to a Challenge Cup final, and with that Challenge Cup final on the horizon in a few weeks, they look at the next couple of weekends and they said they have to rotate their squad somewhere, and they decided to do it against Northampton. Now, what I would argue is I feel, and I'll be interested to know what George Skivington's reasoning for this, was surely they were better off rotating players for their game against Newcastle than they were away to the league leaders Northampton. The reason they might not have wanted to do that is, first of all, it's a home game, it's their final home game of the season. They might not have wanted to do that and rotated the side so heavily in front of their home fans. And also, they might have wanted their players playing the weekend before the Challenge Cup final. So they rest, they play, then they have the Challenge Cup final, rather than them potentially being rusty if they played, rested, and then played again. But again, another reason I thought they might have rotated for this coming weekend in the Newcastle game is it's a 6-day turnaround to the Challenge Cup final. They play on Saturday in the Prem. On Friday, they've got the Challenge Cup final. So I wonder whether they could have been smarter about the way in which they rotated their squad. But I still come back to the fact I don't have a huge issue with the fact that they did rotate their squad, which is why I don't think they were disrespecting the league. And just going back, sorry, went off on a little tangent there. Just going back to the whole, it highlights the issues in the Premiership this year. I think we have seen a couple of games now, Newcastle having 85 points put on them away to Bristol. This one now with Gloucester. The disparity in the league between a couple of clubs at the bottom in Gloucester and Newcastle and everyone else is too big a gap, particularly in a 10-team league. The fact that we have lost 3 different teams, which has concentrated the best talent from Wasps, London Irish and Worcester into the rest of the teams. I just feel like it shouldn't be the case that Gloucester and Newcastle are cut this far adrift. For Newcastle, there's maybe different reasons there in terms of the amount of investment that they're putting into that squad. But even so, that for me would be one of the takeaways when we are discussing this situation. Which brings me on to the Challenge Cup final. Because we get it, right? Whether you agree with it or not, we understand the reasons that Gloucester rotated because of the Challenge Cup final. As I mentioned, that is, they've got nothing to play for in the Premiership. That is what they're going for, and they are going to gear their preparation in the best way they see fit to be able to beat the Sharks and win that final. But I kind of just look at it and feel like, so they went on what? A 9-game losing run between October and January. They were on a terrible run of form. They had the break they beat Sale just before the break for the Six Nations. They then had the break for the Six Nations. They returned. Their Premiership form hasn't been great, but they won the Premiership Cup and they've got themselves to a Challenge Cup final. If you were being really positive in a season where there hasn't been many for Gloucester, you would say they've done a good job of actually saving their season, of at least getting themselves to a position where they could look back on it with some positives. So they've done that, and then they rotate in the way they have against the quality of opposition they have, and they ship 90. To me, my fear would be that in one weekend, they have eviscerated any of the momentum that they were able to build up. Are there longer term effects and impacts from what we saw at the weekend for the momentum that squad was building, and therefore their actual aim of winning the Challenge Cup, if that is the ultimate aim? What does losing 90-0 to Northampton do to that goal? Maybe nothing. Maybe there is the resilience in this team to park that, move on, and they'll be all right once they have a lot of those frontline players that are playing again. But I think the whole negativity around the club that it creates, the questions it creates towards George Skivington and his position as head coach and director of rugby and all that sort of stuff, I think it was a little unwise. And I don't think that's just hindsight. As I've said already, I think looking at the fixtures, looking at the 6-day turnaround to the Challenge Cup final, to me it just would have made more sense to rotate for the game against Newcastle. And I think therefore, subsequently, it puts more pressure on them for that Challenge Cup final. They have to win that game. Their whole season is reliant upon them winning that game at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium towards the end of May, which it would have been anyway, but I just feel like the pressure for that has been ratcheted up because of what we saw at the weekend. And as I've just mentioned, I think it naturally leads to questions about George Skivington and his position, rightly or wrongly. Gloucester fans, I'm so intrigued by your views on him. I really like George Skivington. I think he seems like a thoroughly good bloke, and I think there have been times where he's done a really good job with this squad. However, the bulk of the evidence we have in front of us, it's fair for people to have questions about whether he is the man to take the club forward. And I know some people amongst the fan base, some people within the club, Lewis Ludlow and the like, would absolutely defend him. He would look to the fact of the injuries they've had, of the young players that have been brought into that Gloucester team this year, of Keelan Englefield and Seb Blake, and there's various others. I wanted to say Freddie Clark, but he's the experienced second row. But the other second row that has come in, maybe there are green shoots there. But geez, it was a pretty grim afternoon, wasn't it? How about kicking for 3 points as well, so that they just weren't nilled and still missing it in front of the post? Brutal for Gloucester fans. So those are my general thoughts. What do you make of it? Were Gloucester disrespectful? I don't think they were. I think the bigger issue is some of the questions that I got onto relating to their pursuit of salvaging something of this season, which I got onto at the end of the video. That would be my bigger concern from this, but I don't think they disrespected the Premiership. And as a final point as well, because I'd imagine some people, if you're from South Africa and are watching this video, you might say, well, everyone was kicking off about the Bulls in the Champions Cup and how that was disrespectful. How can Gloucester go and do this in the Premiership? I think the difference between those conversations is it was a Champions Cup quarter-final. It was a Heineken Cup quarter-final that the Bulls rotated so heavily for. Had Gloucester done that for that calibre of game, I think absolutely there would be more. You could understand the calls for it to be that they were being disrespectful, essentially. I think that is the difference there, rather than rotating for a league game when it was basically a dead rubber in that Gloucester, they're not going to get relegated, they can't get Champions Cup, there was nothing riding on it for them. So those are my thoughts. You put yours in the comment section. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.